Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 37. Have we been looking at political polarization in the U.S. all wrong? Here on this podcast, we've talked about ideological divides, the rise of extremes, and the constant outrage cycle. But what if there's a deeper, more fundamental issue driving the hostility between the two sides? Many of us are exhausted by the negativity and division in American politics. We worry about the health of our democracy, yet the conversation seems stuck on who's more extreme. There's got to be a deeper reason for this hostility. A reason that goes beyond simple policy disagreements or a dislike of those on the other side. And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today we're going to explore a new way of understanding the deep divisions in the U.S. with a leading political scientist who's been studying this issue closely. Andreas Schedler is Senior Research Fellow at the Democracy Institute of the Central European University, CEU, in Budapest, Hungary. His research sheds light on this critical issue, focusing on how a surprising factor is driving the us versus them mentality. In his recent article, Rethinking Political Polarization, published in Political Science Quarterly, Dr. Schedler argues that the problem isn't just about differing opinions on policy. It's something deeper, a fundamental breakdown of trust. People increasingly believe the other side is willing to break the rules of democracy itself to win. This lack of trust is leading us down a dangerous path. So stick around as we unpack the latest research, explore this new twist on the polarization dynamic, and discuss what we can do to right the ship with Dr. Andreas Schedler. Well, Andreas, thank you so much for making time to come on the show. I saw your paper and I was really excited to get you on.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here.
So I saw the online version of this, and I understand now that it's been published in Political Science Quarterly. Is that right?
Yes, in the fall issue, just out of the oven.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
So as I noted, when I first saw the paper, I thought, well, this is another one of these sort of foundational documents for the podcast kind of thing, because it seems to align quite well with what we talk about a lot. You know, and I read a book. It's about how we have the left-right spectrum is kind of the wrong way to look at things. Mm-hmm. And you also talk about that this kind of one-dimensional idea of political polarization is not really an adequate way to capture what's going on. Maybe you can tell the listeners a little bit about that.
Yeah, actually, in the way political polarization has been discussed in political science, has been two-dimensional. We distinguish ideological polarization from affective polarization, as you surely know. So the idea is ideological polarization tells us how much in the US, how much Republicans and Democrats differ on certain policy issues. And people just discovered, well, public debate is very heated. The conflict seemed to be really passionate and deep. But if you look closely, ideological differences, policy differences are not that deep, are not that broad. So people moved along to look at what we call affective polarization, kind of polarization in our emotional, on the emotional level. And they discovered, well, yes, people both camps tend to feel kind of very warmly towards themselves and quite cold against the others. And it comes along with the idea that there is at least a certain amount of hate, probably, anger, often rage, well, your podcast cites outrage. These are kind of evaluative emotions. So the idea is emotions run deep. And my observation is, well, that's kind of normal in democracy on the one hand. Democracy means conflict. Democracy is a way of managing, regulating, handling conflict. And so often we really do feel that the other guys are kind of assholes, if you don't mind the language. And I think so. So that's one problem with current debates about polarization, that they talk about kind of the usual stuff of democracy in a way as if it were problematic. So I think if it's problematic, it must be something different. And also, if we have bad feelings about the others, a notion of effective polarization doesn't tell us why do we feel how we feel. Why do we feel that the others are bad guys? Why do we feel the outrage that's out there? And it's these, especially emotions like, rage and outrage, these are emotions that come out of feelings of injustice, of the other side's kind of breaking the rules, violating certain norms. And my observation is that very often what the two camps really believe of each other is that they are bad Democrats, that they are playing foul, that they are not really committed to democracy. And so this would be a third dimension of polarization. I believe in many, many situations, and perhaps even today in the US, it is the central dimension. So people may differ on lots of issues, on gun control, on abortion, etc., on immigration, others. But probably what causes the deepest rift is whether they believe of each other, whether they are capable of, let's say, rigging an election, stealing a democracy, controlling the Supreme Court, etc.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, there's polling out there that shows like large percentage on both sides of the spectrum don't believe the other side has the country's best interest at heart.
Yeah, but what I am thinking about is even worse. So not just the idea that the others are kind of self-interested and amoral actors who put party interests above all. That's kind of standard. But the idea that they do this and they would be even willing to wreck democracy for their own interest, that they would be willing to do anything. And that goes even into like taboo spheres like violence. So we have today kind of mutual fears of political violence, that the other side might be willing to kind of to breach that fundamental rule of democracy, the renunciation of violence, in the pursuit of partisan interests. And that's really something dramatic, I think.
Yeah, and I saw some research, and I'm not sure if your research also sort of aligns with this, but that there's a perception that this backsliding is sort of stronger on one side than the other. But a lot of the data shows that both sides are sort of willing. So some of it was sort of like if you think the other side will do it, you'll do it first, kind of thing. And I don't know if that aligns with any of, you'll sort of go against democratic norms if you think the other side is going to do it first.
Yeah, I think that's kind of why it's so worrisome and why it may be kind of getting out of hand in a vicious circle. Because democracy, we often cite kind of absolute, or we cite democratic norms as if they were absolute, kind of, respect free and fair elections, renounce violence, obey court rulings, etc. But all these norms only hold if you really think that the other side respects them as well. We respect elections as long as we think they are not rigged. We respect Supreme Court rulings as long as we think that the Supreme Court is not just a bunch of partisan hacks, etc. So really the whole edifice of democracy and kind of the set of norms that holds it together is based on this expectation of mutuality. we play fair, you play fair, and we get along. And when this unravels, it's really difficult to see the bounds.
Well, and you see this in the way the indictments are seen as are so, have such a partisan split on how people perceive what's happening there, and and that's another example of the justice system as one of those institutions that when you stop trusting it, or you trust it. What's kind of funny is we can simultaneously sort of hold these inconsistent views. Like we like the justice system when it's going against the person we want to go against, but we don't like the justice system when it's going against the person we don't want them to go against.
Yeah, kind of. In the end, the justice system is what holds democracy as the rule of law together, right? Kind of, even if party actors, party activists, citizens play foul, even if they violate basic rules, we always kind of suppose that there are courts which may put a brake on that, which may come in and punish them, and kind of stop the ball from rolling further. But if we lose that faith in a system of justice that acts in a largely, minimally, predictably fair manner, we lose that possibility of stopping conflict, of regulating conflict, and it's very difficult uh, to see why parties should be restraining themselves when they think that the other party has captured the judicial system.
Yeah, so you talk about this idea of we sort of have this political intolerance, and we view our enemies as sort of adversaries of democracy. Um, so how do you have any ideas of how to sort of get ourselves out of this spiral of viewing adversaries as illegitimate, basically, or illegitimate participants, and sort of see them as existential threats?
Yeah, this is really the 100 million question, right? How to get out of such circles. If you look at history, these things have often ended in catastrophe. And that's something we don't want, right? I mean, we see that. I mean, I'm from Austria. In interwar Austria, we had such a spiral of polarization, and kind of those people who saw each other as enemies sat together in prison and then learned, well, probably we should have treated each other differently. But of course, we don't want this. We don't want to end democracy in dictatorship or civil war and then start adjusting our behavior. Um, there are many initiatives who kind of focus on what I would call the communicative pathologies polarization tends to generate. So there are many initiatives that try to kind of change this, to get us back into dialogue, to discover common ground between the two camps. And I think these are laudable efforts, but they tend to be very local. They don't have to be kind of great reach. And it's difficult how they could manage to break a public atmosphere fed from below, but basically fed from above by elite rhetoric, by politicians, by radio hosts, by TV anchors, etc. So this is kind of nice, but it's difficult to see how such efforts at citizen dialogue and cross-party dialogue may get us anywhere. So it's really difficult to see where to look at. Also, kind of often we have faith in kind of third-party actors, kind of conciliatory figures that emerge because both sides kind of get exhausted or get tired or don't really want to keep playing that game. But such figures often fail. They fail to get traction. So kind of the place where most people look at is kind of within parties, within the big camps. And this is actually, I think, if we look closely also at public opinion polls, and I myself have just done an online survey in the US, just kind of looking at the data. And one thing we are seeing is that there are kind of two ways of interpreting the data and the ways Republicans and Democrats view each other. One way is to emphasize kind of the breakdown of trust, and to be alarmed by the extent to which both sides see each other as completely opportunistic, as completely amoral power players who do not care about democracy, who are in a sense undemocratic actors. So this is on the one hand alarming, but at the same time we see that there are really significant portions on both sides who kind of give the other side the benefit of doubt, and issue statements that are not as harsh as we might expect them to be. And also certain kind of significant groups within both camps, which are self-critical, and would concede, oh yes, party elites, kind of political elites on our sides, they are not entirely democratic either. They do things I don't agree with. So I think we do have a certain potential, which we might call conciliatory, this mixture of self-criticism and leniency that might create some hope of changing the dynamics within either camp.
Yeah, and I think there's a perception issue there too, that we sort of, the media is, of course, and a lot of these other actors are sort of, they're incentivized to sort of show us the bad parts, right? And sort of like it's kind of boring when people are kind of in the middle there and are willing to look at their own side. They're willing to sort of have tolerance for the other side. That's not a good story. No one wants to see that on TV, right? So what we see is mostly the fighting. So we sort of have this perception that those fighting sides are bigger and more powerful than they really are, I think.
Well, I would say at this stage of the game, seeing people who do not participate in that game, that seems kind of exciting, isn't it? I mean, kind of the boredom tends to be more on the predictable recriminations of both sides. And I think at this point, it's getting exciting to see people who kind of step out of these kind of interlocking accusations and do something different.
Well, that's what I'm hoping. That's the premise of my whole podcast. We're kind of oblivious to it when we're doing it. And even sometimes when our own side is doing it, right? Because it feels good. We like it. We kind of like, oh, but they're doing the exact same thing you just said you didn't want to do. And, that blindness to it is, and so you talk about those groups that are out there, trying to, sort of do civility and cross-party conversation, things like that. That's a little self-selective too, right? So the people that sort of go participate in that probably have a desire to do it. So anyway, I that's one area that I'm a little concerned about, these blind spots that we have to it. And people say, well, we just have to educate people. Well, okay, we're all trying to do that, I guess, but like, how do you break through that?
Yeah, that's really difficult. But I think that blindness is really central. In these days, we often talk about, the age of post-truth in relation with conspiracy theories, etc. I don't think we are in the age of post-truth. I think we are still in a situation where both sides, if you talk about two sides, where both sides really are engaged in a struggle over truth. Both sides think that they want to talk about the real world. They think they grasp realities. It's not that one side just renounces reality and says, oh no, we are happy in our fantasy world and we talk about something else. You talk about reality, that's your domain, and we talk about Lego or medieval spirits or whatever. So it's really it's a fight over reality, and kind of the critical difference between the two sides is whom they trust, which sources they trust. And we often see really kind of some kind of, yeah, you call it blindness or split consciousness or split universe of trust, in the sense that kind of everybody sees themselves as critical citizens. Kind of nobody thinks that, oh, I'm naive, I believe everything. You can tell me what you want. I'm one-sided. I'm manipulative. No. Nobody thinks of themselves as easy prey of manipulation. But kind of the point is that there is this strange bipolarity that, and it's most obvious in conspiracy theories, that people kind of they are entirely skeptical and disbelieving towards everything that smells of, official, institutional, science, big enterprise, public institutions, the state, the government. All that is distrusted. So an enormous amount of distrust, and at the other side, an enormous amount of almost a childlike gullibility. That if it's my sources, if it's the people I believe, I believe anything. Yeah? And so if there would be something we should be doing ourselves, and we should be kind of advising to others, is kind of this, to establish some kind of critical instance in our minds that always tells us, hey, pause a moment, think twice. If anybody tells us nasty stuff about the others, try to be fair. Try to put yourself in their shoes. Try to understand how they see the world, and try to revise your easy conclusions. And I know that's kind of a moral exhortation that is difficult to follow, but it's kind of, okay, kind of what else in a world where it's so easy to reproduce our prejudices unthinkingly, except in telling people and telling ourselves, well, let's think for a moment.
Yeah. I mean, the thing you like that sounds the best to you, that's the one where you sort of have to ask yourself, are they telling me the whole story here? And that's hard to do when you really like that, when you really like what you're hearing. So I wanted to switch a little bit to, I kind of, this is just kind of my own opinion. And, I feel like we still haven't really, learned the lessons from sort of what we saw with 2016 elections, what we saw that led all the way up to the January 6th attacks. I feel like we haven't really taken much from that. And in the sense that the Trump supporters and those that attacked the Capitol, like, they do have sort of, I don't know if legitimate's the right word, but they're genuine, hurt. They're hurt, they're grieved, they're, and so I'm not saying, I'm certainly not saying we need to, sort of appease the people that attacked the Capitol, but there are 70 million people or some odd that voted for Trump. And we also just can't dismiss them as sort of ignorant and racist and so on, that I still feel like we are not doing that well. And so I and you talk about this a little bit in terms of how, that kind of this animosity or this affective polarization situation kind of helped drive a lot of that, and that we responded poorly. So what would be how should have we responded, I guess?
Well, just to begin with, I think you're absolutely right. We should take we should acknowledge at least their perceptions and their view of the world. And kind of my idea of polarization as a breakdown of basic democratic trust speaks to that. It's a diagnosis that is kind of formulated not at the level of objective facts, but at the level of how we view each other and how we talk of each other. And so often people think that the problem we face is kind of the different values, a breakdown of values. I don't think that's the case. I think that those people who stormed the Capitol, they think they are Democrats. They embrace the values of democracy as we usually put them in our textbooks. They cherish the Constitution, etc. But they have that belief we think is fundamentally mistaken. that the election was robbed. So it's really a problem at the matter of beliefs, perceptions, constructions of reality, much more than at the level of values. And I think we have to recognize that. And then the question is, how can we reach them? How can we engage with them in a conversation that would make them, I don't say accept, but at least start evaluating our reasons, our arguments, the evidence we can mobilize to tell them, well, the elections were fundamentally free and fair. Your grievances are imaginary. You have been misled by a clown. But that's really due to the communicative blockades and barriers polarization itself and that deep mistrust itself generates. It's super difficult to engage in that kind of dialogue. I think the way you present that problem may be a bit misleading in terms of, the 70 million. There's another figure that's kind of circulating a lot. The 70% of Republicans, 60 or 70% of Republicans who believe that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president because the election was rigged. These figures are real to some extent, but I think it's possible to break them down. And if you break them down, I've done that in that online survey we did in last July. Then you see that only really a minority, even of Republicans, really says, I am fully convinced that Donald Trump won that election. And also, if you ask them, do you have good evidence for that? Only really a minority of them says, oh, yes, we do have good evidence. The others would be kind of more qualified and said, yes, there were lots of suspicious things going on, but who knows? And so I think there are, even within that seemingly uniform block, there are kind of fissures and openings where we might kind of start a conversation. There may be some, I don't know, a 15% of the population that is lost to conversation. That's possible. But 15% is not 30, is not 50. So I think we kind of the possibilities of really reconnecting within the two camps are not that bleak as it often seems.
Yeah, so I know we didn't talk about a lot of the recommendations that you have put out in your paper. I'll make sure that a lot of that is in the show notes. But I know you talk about the ideas of some things like civic education. I think you talk about things like opening up elections more than they are now, and trying to encourage our party elites to moderate their positions. I know that's a few. I think you have other ones in there as well.
Well, I'll say actually my paper is weak on practical advice and hopefully strong in clarifying our debate. But I think that would be one big thing, one big progress already. I think if you know what we talk when we talk about polarization. But it's not just any tiny heated debate we kind of try to contain because we identified as transgressive polarization that we should be getting over with, but kind of to address the really the deep issues that divide us, the fundamental ones. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Andreas, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you, David. It was a great pleasure.
And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.